Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Hernan Reyes. He is a medical doctor and medical coordinator for detention-related activities for the International Committee of the Red Cross. Hernan, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you, Eric.
Tell us a little about your background. Where were you born?
Oh, that's a long story and a rather complicated story. I was born in Santiago de Chile, of Chilean parents, and actually I only lived there for, I think, something like 20 months. When I was not quite 2 years old, my father got a job as a translator at the UN in New York. So we moved, my mother, my dad, and myself, we moved to New York, where I stayed for 13 years. And then at age 15, he was transferred, still with the UN, to the Palais des Nations, the Geneva office in Switzerland of the UN, so I moved to Europe. By then, my sister had been born. She is an American citizen. She was born in New York. Then I stayed in Geneva for the next 30 years, and then moved to France for 5 years, and now I've been in New York for 18 months. So it's a bit of a complicated story.
So internationalism, in a way, came with your mother's milk, so to speak.
Yes, in a way.
So your secondary education was in New
Geneva.
York City, in Geneva.
In Geneva, in French, yes.
Yeah. Did you have any teachers in particular that influenced the direction you took, or was it all because of what your father did and what you were, where you were living?
More than any specific teacher, it was more than the secondary school, which I just did a bit of in New York, which was the UN school, the United Nations school, which is a private school, but essentially it's for the people who work in the UN. So there I had classmates from everywhere, from Outer Mongolia, from Peru, from everywhere in Europe, from Africa and Asia. So that was the international approach which really influenced me, because we had debates about what was going on. We learned much more about international affairs than we would have in a public school, for example.
And there must have been an extraordinary diversity among the students.
Oh yes, and the school was very keen on promoting tolerance and showing that we were all equal. And this was in the 60s, when the civil rights movement was just catching on, and we already had debates on racism, on all these issues, which were very important, of course.
Do you remember any books in particular that you read as a young person that influenced you?
That influenced what I'm doing now?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I've thought about that lately, and I read a lot of books on prisons at the time, never knowing that I would never ever get near a prison. The Wooden Horse, for example, by Eric Williams, all these escape stories of World War II, stories about prisons in the Middle Ages. Reynald de Chatillon, who spent 16 years in the dungeons of Saladin, and I never really gave it much thought. But of course, this comes back to me now when I'm now working in prisons for the past 15 years at least. They've come back to me. Yeah.
And do your visits to prisons in your work, which we'll talk about in a minute, do they recall images from the books that you read?
They recall one specific film, which I don't remember the title of, which I saw a very long time ago, about a visit where you actually see somebody from the Red Cross, and one of the prisoners, a woman, actually stands out and says, "Don't believe them, it's all lies." And the Red Cross official gets completely turned away. Says, "No, she's just crazy. Come this way." And she gets tortured and she is killed. It shows a farcical Red Cross visit. At the time, I had no idea what the Red Cross was. I never imagined I would be working myself for the Red Cross. I remember that film now.
But you saw this film when you were young.
Oh, when I was 12 or 13 on the television.
That's amazing. What about your parents? How did you think, in retrospect, they influenced you and shaped your character?
Well, they definitely, my father was a linguist. He went to the UN because he spoke English, French, and Spanish, and he taught himself Russian while he was in New York. So that's probably why I also picked up a few languages, but nowhere with the effort he had, actually. I learned them free, so to say, in the States and in Geneva. That was definitely an influence. And my mother was a professor of history, so that's maybe why I've always been very interested in history.
So they helped place you in the
in
work.
A way, yes.
Yeah,
in a way.
In the world, yeah. But you chose to seek a medical degree. What led you into medicine?
Well, actually, medicine was actually second choice. In Geneva, my big hobby when I was a high school student was Maya archaeology, of all things. But of course, being in Geneva, Switzerland, it wasn't very practical. I mean, I could do Egyptology, but I wasn't interested in the pharaohs. I was interested in the Maya. And the only way would have been to go to Mexico, which was impossible at the time. So I said, okay, forget that. What else gives me an outlook and a wide span of choices? Medicine. Why not? And in medicine, I decided to take obstetrics and gynecology, which was really what I was interested in.
And so was your first job with the International Committee of the Red Cross?
No, I worked as an obstetrician and
gynecologist
so you actually
for 6
years.
years.
Yes. I did my training.
But human rights, international work was in your blood, as we just discussed, or?
Well, it turned out to be that way, but I was headed for a career in obstetrics and gynecology. I actually was named director of a hospital in Switzerland, and finally decided not to take that job, although I had one, I could have taken it, because the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, asked me to stay on with them.
And what were your first assignments? I mean, did you start doing work with prisoners, or did you have a different portfolio in the beginning in the Red Cross?
Well, being OBGYN, I couldn't really do any medical work with the Red Cross, because in the countries where we work, there is no place for a gynecologist. They need a surgeon or a midwife, but not a gynecologist. Mm-hmm. So since I couldn't do anything in my line of work, I decided, well, why not do something completely different? Prison work, because there's a lot of prison work to be done. And my first assignment was to have been in Nicaragua, actually. But what happened was that the head of the local Red Cross was a guy called Salvador Reyes, same name as me. And so they decided, oh, you can't go there. They're going to think you're part of the family. This is never going to work out. Why don't we send you to Argentina? This is 1982. Mm-hmm. And Argentina at the time covered not only Argentina proper, but Uruguay, Paraguay, and Chile. What they forgot is that with my Chilean background, they should never have sent me to Argentina. Mm-hmm. So I ended up visiting prisoners in Argentina and in Chile, which I really shouldn't have done. There was never any problem. Mm-hmm. But so that's the way I ended up doing political prisoners. This was in the early 80s when all the military dictatorships were on.
Before we talk a little more about that, let's help people understand what exactly the International Committee of the Red Cross is and what its mandate is. For a U.S. audience, of course, we mostly think of the Red Cross as a national organization dealing with disasters, but that's not really the main mandate of your committee, or is it?
Well, actually, the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, is the founding body of what we call the Red Cross family. The Red Cross movement, actually, is the official name. Founded in 1863 in Geneva, and essentially it was founded to do something about the war wounded that were not taken care of in any systematic way. And this fellow from Geneva and a colleague from the Netherlands, Henri Dunant in the first case and Bastien in the Netherlands, put together this concept, first of all, of medical neutrality and of caring for the non-combatant who is wounded and who should be protected. And the most novel part was to have a convention between states that would respect, whereby the states would respect this protection. And they created the International Committee of the Red Cross, and part of it was that each state that adhered to this Red Cross movement and to the convention would have its own national society of Red Cross, which would do the same thing, which would organize these volunteers who would pick up the wounded in the war. And that was the beginning. After a time, particularly after World War I, where there were so many volunteers in the American Red Cross, the League of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society was created to use these volunteers and not to disband them. And this was created in the States. It's our sister organization, so to say. The International Committee of the Red Cross is in Geneva. The Federation, now called Federation of Red Cross Society, was created in the States. And they precisely organize relief to disasters, earthquakes, or natural disasters. And that's why everybody has the impression that the American Red Cross is dealing with disasters, whereas we deal in man-made disasters, namely war.
And what this is really about, interestingly enough, is peoples in different parts of the world and private organizations concerned about the norms that we're going to live by as states deal with each other. So this movement really was an engine for new norms on these issues in international affairs, right? Correct?
Well, yes, because it's called international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions form part of what is called international humanitarian law, which regulates what can be done and what cannot be done in time of war, in time of warfare. And as you know, there are now 4 Geneva Conventions, one of them on prisoners of war, which is the third one on shipwrecked people, one on war wounded, and possibly the most important one now is the 4th Convention, which on civilians, how civilians should be treated in case of war.
Now, when the main concern was countries at war, your mandate was a little clearer that it's become now in the present international environment, where conflicts within states become really important issues, and not just conflicts between states.
Well, the Geneva Conventions apply to what we call international war. But luckily, all four of them have what we call common Article 3, which has been said to be a little Geneva Convention on its own, which is the hard core of what has to be respected in any case. And it says something to the effect of, in cases of non-international war, which could be anything, which could be civil war, which could be just internal troubles or just internal strife, there are certain basic principles that have to be respected. People should not be tortured, people should not be kidnapped, civilians, men and women, women and children and elderly persons should be respected particularly. And it is on that basis that the ICRC today works in most countries, because there are no longer any international wars going on all the time.
And in your work, you primarily are involved in looking at the places where people are incarcerated for primarily political reasons, as opposed to just criminal acts within the society in which they live.
Well, yeah, the ICRC, among its many other activities, visits prisoners. As we said, in international wars, I visited POWs in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Iran, in Iraq, and other places, in China and Vietnam. And also, by extension, as we said, in internal wars or political prisoners. But also, and more recently, in places that are no longer really in a state of war, but where there has to have been some sort of trouble, some troubled situation. For example, in Transcaucasia, we had the separatist Abkhazia movement years ago, which is not hasn't flared up now. But that was the reason for us being in the Republic of Georgia and visiting prisoners in the Republic of Georgia and in many other countries as well.
Now, a few minutes ago, you were saying that you started in Argentina and neighboring countries. How many countries do you visit these days in a particular year? First the Red Cross, then you personally.
Well, last year the Red Cross visited something like 200,000 something prisoners in 40 contexts, not necessarily countries, but contexts, because you may have different delegations in a different country, which makes two contexts for one country. So something like 40 countries. I myself have visited over the 15 years where I worked for the ICRC. I visited something like 30 countries on all continents.
And you are bringing to these encounters in the prison essentially two sets of values, right? One is a medical doctor, and the other, the set of evolving international norms about how prisoners are to be treated. Is there a contradiction between these two sets of standards, or as you do your work, or are they naturally reconcilable?
Well, it's not me who brings them in. We have teams, we have delegations in the countries,
right,
and we have doctors participating in the visits in these countries. My job is to have a part in the training of these people we send out, who actually stay in the field for 6 months or possibly a year. And the message which I give to our doctors and nurses when they go out is to try to obtain conduct which is acceptable for these prisoners. Acceptable, it's possibly not a good word, because who are we to accept? There are norms around, there are many norms around, issued by the United Nations, by the Council of Europe for certain, by certain regional treaties. And so what we try to do is to obtain proper treatment for these prisoners according to local standards. Of course, when we go to a prison in sub-Saharan Africa, we will not ask for the same conditions we would ask for in the Middle East or in Europe or in Latin America. So we take the local standard and try to get the best treatment possible with local standards.
And what sort of general conditions are you looking for as a team goes to a particular country?
Well, first of all, physical and psychological integrity. First of all, the people do not disappear, are not just executed, are not kidnapped, don't disappear, as we say. And if indeed they are in prison, that they are treated correctly. We understand that there may be circumstances where people are arrested, may have to be interrogated, but they should be respected, as we said, according to this hardcore, at the very least, this hardcore of minimum standards, which say that people should not be mistreated, should not be tortured, and that prisoners have certain rights. This is something which is sometimes difficult to have accepted by the people who keep them. I remember one prison director who says, here prisoners have no rights, they only have obligations. And of course this is wrong, they do have rights.
And in an area such as torture, which is a tool of a state to force prisoners to say things, to change their behavior? What is the kinds of evidence you look for to prove or disprove whether torture has occurred?
Well, torture, there's no excuse for torture. Torture is always illegal. It's something which we really have to stress. There's no excuse for torture. We often have to come up again with arguments against people who say, yes, but you know, these people may have planted a bomb. In this case, we have to get the information out of them, and torture is justified. Torture is never justified, first thing. We always rely on the testimonies. Testimonies, perhaps not a good word because it has a judicial connotation. We rely on the talks in private we have with prisoners. That's one of the conditions we stay. We have to be able to talk to people in private, find out what the stories are. And what I tell our doctors, don't just look for physical evidence, because it's a mistake. If you look only for physical evidence, you're telling the authorities that if there are no scars visible, there has been no torture, and that, of course, is wrong. So I want people to rely more on what the converging testimonies give us on the situation and what state these people are in, and then to draw up a document explaining to the government that this is a totally illegal way to interrogate people, and they should not exercise torture in any way.
So when you go to a particular country, you essentially have two sets of negotiations, or maybe more. One is you have to negotiate and set terms with the authorities who are in charge of the prison on the one hand, but with the other hand, you essentially have to establish the conditions by which the prisoners will trust you and tell you what you want to know and what is in their best interest to tell you.
Absolutely. It's on two completely different levels. The negotiations to actually get into a country, of course, is done at a very high level in Geneva between the office. That's nowhere near where I am. I'm in the medical division. The negotiations are done between the ICRC and the government that has to allow the ICRC in, and there are separate conditions, sine qua non conditions, without which we will not actually do visits in a country. On my level is more to train the teams, especially the medical components of the team, on what to look for, how to look for it, how to not to do harm when they're trying to do good. The idea is not to reinterrogate prisoners. The idea is to talk to them, to listen to them, to reestablish contact with their families, find out what the conditions are, find out if they've been tortured, and then put all of this together and draw up a report to try to get betterment in all aspects.
So how do you go about establishing trust, or do your teams establish trust with prisoners?
Well, it varies from one country to another. Some countries know about the Red Cross and are even expecting the Red Cross. They've heard about it. They've heard that the Red Cross is going to visit. It's obviously a bit easier. In some places, they have no idea what the Red Cross is. Red Cross, Blue Cross, outside organization. You have to first establish trust in the sense that what you say, what they say to you is not going to go out, is not going to go to the director, and it's not going to go out into the press either. And you have to establish trust mainly by showing that you do come back to them, that you don't put them in danger, and that you're indeed there to help them, either by advising them directly or counseling them or giving them some kind of medical counsel actually on the spot, or perhaps ensuring that improvements are made. And once they see that improvements are made, that there are no reprisals between this visit and the next visit, you get the trust. The first visit is always very difficult.
And how do you overcome those difficulties in the first visit?
Well, the first visit you have to really explain what you can do and what you can't do, and never make any promises that you can't keep. You should be able to promise that you're coming back, but even then I'm wary because you never know. Maybe all of a sudden negotiations will break down, and the people I promised to see, I cannot see because they don't let me into the country. When I say me, I mean the teams. I don't necessarily mean myself. And so it's always very delicate in these cases, but because the countries where we go are countries, if they have political prisoners, it means something may be going on which is untoward and which, of course, the government may want to hide.
Now, in preparation for this first visit, who will you have talked to before you actually come to the prison? What sort of research have you done, and so on? Because I would imagine that's important for winning in winning over the prisoner in that first initial interview?
Well, again, it's at two different levels. The political negotiating is done by the ICRC headquarters and what we call the heads of delegation, who are actually on the spot, who actually negotiate at a ministerial level or presidential level even, to try to obtain the minimum conditions for our teams to go in. On a lower level, in Geneva, there is some preparatory work to be done, gather all the information we have on the conditions. We get information from many other NGOs and other organizations who do work with prisoners and who don't necessarily go in, who can't go in. And they, of course, give us all this information. And then we prepare the visit, and each and every visit has to be prepared, and our teams have to be briefed on what to expect, and so they know how much time to plan for a visit and how to go about a visit. A visit is very different, of course, if in Afghanistan, from South Africa, from Uruguay. You know, these three countries are completely different, and the tactics will be different as well.
And is there often an interpreter with you as you do these, or do you bring somebody with you who's part of your team who knows the language?
Ideally, our delegates should know the language. We try to do that, for example, with the languages that are most common. In Latin America, we always have used delegates who spoke Spanish or Portuguese. That was never a problem. We try more and more to have delegates who are Russian-speaking when we work in the countries of the former Soviet Union, but in other countries, in Africa particularly, there's so many dialects that it's impossible. In that case, we try to have someone on the team who comes with us, who is seen as being part of our team. We try not to use local people and not to use, as far as possible, co-detainees, because you never know exactly who they might be.
And when you do these interviews, are authorities from the prison present, or do you have private interviews?
Interviews have to be, that's one of the preconditions, have to be in private. And an interview in private means exactly that. But before that, when you imagine you're going into a prison, you're seeing dozens, possibly hundreds of prisoners. What we very often do is, first of all, explain to the group what we're doing, and then cell by cell, in groups again, to break the ice, explain that we're going to look into living conditions, into food, into sanitary conditions, and then say, well, we're also going to be having individual talks. All of you who have, for example, a medical problem or something specific they want to say, we shall be able to talk in private. In private means nobody there from the authorities, but it also means nobody there from the other prisoners, because we never know at the beginning what kind of internal hierarchy they may be, and we don't want any coercion either from the authorities or from other prisoners.
And do you, in your view, do the prisoners see you as primarily a doctor, or as primarily the representative of a humanitarian organization that might be able to help them, or is it both?
It depends. When you have very politicized, very sophisticated prisoners, they see you more as a representative of this organization that gives them legitimacy in some cases. Even though we always say that the Red Cross does not give any political status to anybody. We actually avoid using the term political prisoner because it may block the authorities in many cases. But of course, these sophisticated political prisoners are very savvy, and they know that we don't visit people who steal bicycles in Norway, for example. If we're in the country, it's because something is going on. On the other hand, in other countries where they don't know much about Red Cross, International Committee, Red Cross, international humanitarian law, they see us mainly as someone who's trying to help them. And in this case, they would see me and my colleagues as physicians.
And the individual interviews with prisoners are how long?
It depends. I can't imagine having an interview that would last less than 20 minutes, which of course some people think that's ridiculous. How can you talk only 20 minutes? It's much too short. But when you think you have maybe 700 prisoners to see in just a few days, and there are many other things to see just besides the talks. You have to look into the health system. You have to look into the food, etc. You have to have an average. Of course, some people may need much more. In cases of torture, of course, you'll take as much time as you need, all the while knowing that we're not there to provide therapy. We're just there to find out what happened, answer questions, provide whatever comfort we can. But I would say 20 minutes, half an hour, they very rarely go over. Although I've had interviews that lasted 4 hours in some cases, but that was very rare. That was really extremely rare.
And do you have a checkoff list in your mind, or have you done this so much that you can move away from such a list, whether you have it on paper or in your mind?
Well, I tend to stay away from checklists because, first of all, if you ask questions, the only thing you get is answers. And by making checklists, the problem is that the inexperienced physician who does a visit will stick to the checklist and tick them off and then not see that which is not on the checklist, which may be the most obvious problem. So I tend to stay away from checklists, but of course in training it is useful to have some kind of scheme in the mind at least, but I tend to stay away from checklists.
In this interview, at one level you're dealing with the prisoner on a generic level. What can this prisoner tell me about the situation here? But you obviously, as a physician, and knowing you are also dealing on a very personal level, getting a sense of the person as a human being. How do you move between those two different formulations of the situation you're in?
Well, it depends on what the problem actually is. We're not there because we cannot treat anybody. And what I tend to tell our colleagues not to do is, I say, the last thing you want to do is go into a cell with 80 people and say, I'm a Red Cross doctor. Who wants to see the Red Cross doctor? You're going to get 160 hands up in the air, and they all want to go to see you, because obviously in a prison, very often they do not trust the prison doctor, and it may have adequate treatment, but they don't necessarily believe they have adequate treatment, and they have ALS. So on the one hand, you have people who actually need some kind of counseling, other people who have been tortured and want to tell you about it, either because they want to know for themselves what the effects are, or because they want to rightly denounce it and say, you should know about this, something should be done. Since you're here to visit us, you should do something about the situation. It varies greatly. So some people you see as patients, some people you see as prisoners who represent other prisoners.
And do, after the first interview, you've come back, or do you bond with particular prisoners over time? I mean, do you make a point of seeing a particular prisoner who you saw on the first or second visit on the third visit?
Well, there's two levels with that as well. Those who you feel may have put themselves in danger, particularly on a first visit, by telling you things which you know the authorities would not want you to know. You obviously do register their identity, so you can look them up next time and find out if anything happened. If anything untoward happened, you of course try to do something about it. On a more personal level, of course, there are prisoners who you would like to see again because they've had a medical problem, or just because you've had a good interview with them. You do tend to look people up, but all the while staying fair and trying to see as many people as you can, and not have any favoritism in your visits.
Of the prisoners who you have examined over the years and who were there for the wrong reasons and are suffering the worst conditions, what are the elements that do you think that tell you which ones will survive and which won't?
Difficult to say. The other day I was asked what form of torture was the worst form of torture. I remember distinctly some political prisoners telling me that for them the worst form of torture was solitary confinement. They said they had been severely beaten, they had been tortured with electricity and other niceties, and they said the worst part was being in strict solitary confinement for months on end, for 6, 8, 9, 12 months. For them that was much worse. And luckily these political prisoners happened to be very intellectually strong, and so they devised methods to cope with that. I think that would be very, very, very difficult.
And what sorts of methods do they devise?
One of them, well, there are various methods. One of them had found 2 or 3 links of a bicycle chain in his cell. That's all. He had no mattress, no books, of course, nothing. He found 2 links of a bicycle chain, and he told me he spent 2 whole weeks trying to devise in his mind how to create a machine that would make this kind of link with the articulations in it. And it said, yes, it sounds futile, but that kept me busy, and I had to keep my mind busy. Another in the same context explained how he used to sometimes receive an orange from one of the guards, very rarely. And he would start cutting the orange up in the morning and just cut it a little bit, and then 2 hours later take off a little bit and try to remember when was the last time I had an orange outside. Then he'd take off the skin on one half. And it would take him up the whole day, just by trying to peel the orange, and finally at the end of the day he would eat the orange, and it would have kept him busy, and it would bring back memories. He tried to associate everything he could with that memory of the orange.
So kind of mental games. Yes. that pass the time away.
Absolutely.
Right. Are religious individuals in prison more likely or just as likely to survive as those that have a political ideology?
I think I've seen both. I've seen all sorts of religions in prison, and I've also seen prisoners who had no religion and who kept saying, I'm sure there is a difference there. It depends. It's something based on inner strength, which can come from religion and can come from other sources.
And what other sorts of populations do you find as prisoners who are particularly vulnerable? Women who are the spouses of political actors and so on, are they more vulnerable, or are they just as resilient or more resilient than men?
Well, women in general, I say that it again depends on what sort of women. Women political prisoners can be stronger than men in many cases. I remember seeing some political prisoners who were actually were giving a very rough time to the authorities, and it was the authorities actually almost were asking us to help them cope with all this internal rebellion, internal resistance that kept coming back and back and back again, despite all the coercion they exert on these women prisoners. Women can be very tough. I would say that it breaks down in a different way. If a prisoner knows why he's in prison, and I'm talking about political prisoners expect to be jailed at some time, and some of them expect to be tortured. On the other hand, prisoners who are just captured because they're the wrong religion or the wrong ethnic group have no preparation for that. They have a very rough time. So in this case, when you have people who are not militant at all but happen to be caught up in circumstances whereby they're thrown into prison, even though they may have been less severely tortured than political prisoners, they have a very difficult time coping.
In your article on torture, you make the point that sometimes the worst torture can be being blindfolded as you're being struck and not know where the next blow is coming from. So a lot of this, obviously the blow hurts, but the psychology of not being able to see where the blow is coming and defend yourself intensifies the problem. So this is really often not just about the scars, the physical signs of what has been done, but also the emotional.
Well, it's both, actually. And I always tell our people not to make a clear distinction between physical torture and psychological torture. Physical torture, of course, has psychological sequelae and consequences. And psychological torture, even if you don't touch the person, may also have physical consequences. And in this case, the blindfold you mentioned, I don't know if it's the worst form of torture, but it's part and parcel of torture. And again, here we have physical and psychological. Psychological, of course, you don't know where the blow is coming from. You can't expect it. You can't prepare yourself. And also physical in the sense that you're in a much more tense situation. For example, if you have someone who's blindfolded and suspended, and someone who's not blindfolded and suspended, and you approach that person with an electric prod, if you can see the prod coming, you can brace yourself, you can prepare yourself physically. But if you can't see it, you can have these spasms, which are much more intense. So you have the psychological component and also the physical component. And that is why prisoners are blindfolded. We're always told that prisoners are blindfolded so they don't see the guard, not to say the torture. Of course, that's part of it, but it's not. It's part of the torture itself because it has this potentializing effect on the torture.
We have discussed one group that you have to deal with, namely the prisoners and the prisoner population. But we also said that you have to navigate the rocks in the sea here of these prisons that come from the authorities, basically. Now, you've negotiated your presence. You've set some rules. In other words, you and the Red Cross, your teams will not come to the prison unless the authorities have met several conditions. What are those conditions?
The conditions are we shouldn't be allowed to see all places of detention and all prisoners. We have to be allowed to talk to them in private, in a place of our choosing, with our own interpreters, not with their interpreters, not in the director's office. We have to be allowed to repeat the visit when we feel necessary. Not 2 years later, not necessarily 2 months later, maybe 2 weeks later, maybe 6 months later, depending on need. And the fourth condition, which is actually part of the third condition, is we have to be allowed to register their identities, because we repeat the visit to people, not to places. If we see 3 people, you don't necessarily have to identify them. You can recognize them. But if you see 300 people, you have to know who they are, to be able to see the prisoner who you felt was putting himself in danger, as we said, to make sure there were no reprisals. Or if someone is no longer there, you want to know, well, who is that person? He's been transferred to a different jail. We want to go see him, find out what happened, make sure he hasn't been executed outside. So those are the 3 conditions, the 4 conditions we insist on having, otherwise we don't go in.
So when you actually come to these places, it's almost like a maze in a computer game, because you essentially have to understand the geography of the prison, know where you're going, where you've been, where the cells are, where the prisoners eat, on the one hand, right?
Absolutely, and it can be quite difficult in some cases. Some prisons are very big, some prisons are very complicated, not only in architecture, but also in the different groups that are inside the prison, different ethnic groups, different hierarchies, different groups of prisoners. The coercion may not necessarily come only from the authorities, but also from inside, from prisoners amongst themselves. And you have to understand a prison is difficult. You don't understand it even on a first visit. Even if you're thorough, sometimes it's only on the second possibly even the third visit, that you begin to really understand. And that's where continuity is so important. Continuity means visiting regularly and also having some continuity in the people. If you send a new team each time, you're going to lose information and you're going to miss things.
Mm-hmm. Now, and although your primary goal is to, I guess, secure the personal dignity and the human rights of the prisoner, you actually have to not only win the respect of the prisoners, have them tell you their stories, but you have to maintain the respect of the prison authorities.
Yes, that's why we always work in transparency. We explain to the authorities why we're there. We have a clause of confidentiality, which means we don't go out and denounce what we see. Okay. Which is it's our way of working. It wouldn't make any sense for us to go into a prison and to publish a report which got us out of the prison immediately. Mm-hmm. There are many other organizations that do a very remarkable job of reporting, and they're in the business of publishing and making known to the world what is going on. They don't need one other organization to do the same thing. It's a question of complementarity. They do the publishing, they do the footwork to get to know what is going in a country, and we actually go into the prisons. We work on a confidential basis with the government, and we don't publish, but we visit the people, not only the VIPs, but also the little guy in the back that nobody may know about. And this way of working allows us to go back in, and just because we work on a confidential basis doesn't mean we don't say anything. We do the lobbying within the country at all levels to try to get betterment in all conditions.
So if you find outrageous conditions in a prison, in a particular cell block, your mandate, as you see it, and your goal is to report it to the prison authorities on the one hand, but on the other hand, to report it to other parts of the government in the same country to see if the situation can be ameliorated through these outside pressures.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very rare that a government is so monolithic that nothing can change without one person changing it. Usually you have several ministries. You have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who may be getting a rough time at the UN because of alleged violations, and who has an interest in having the Red Cross visit, and also may have an interest in getting betterment of conditions. So we try to not play one ministry against the other, but try to use all these factors so that improvements are indeed made, and that's the way it works. And it's not just the prison authorities, it's the ministerial level, even presidential level in some cases.
And even friendly countries that provide aid to the country that is the home for the prison you're visiting?
Oh, yeah, for example, we visited for years now in Northern Ireland. And of course, the British Red Cross and the UK in general is one of the providers of staff and also funding for the Red Cross. But we have definitely visited the prisons there because there arguably are troubles going on in Northern Ireland. And actually, it has been very useful. We should say this. It has been very useful to be able to say, at least in the past. Now it's a bit more. That's a bit different with the end of the Cold War. In the past, it was very useful to be able to tell countries that we're not visiting only in these third world countries. We're also visiting in Europe, in Spain, in the UK, in Poland.
You in the beginning of our conversation, you talked about the founding of the International Committee and the idealism and concerns that drove the founders of the International Committee. And then you talked about the actual work and the development of articles and protocols that sort of define the norms. As you've worked at this business for a while now, do you see an improvement that we're all moving forward on the actual implementation of the norms and improvement of the condition of prisoners in most places?
Well, it would be very difficult to generalize, but there have been improvements in many places, and of course violence flares up again, and again we have to start back at square one in other places. But on, at least at my level, on the more health, medical level, there have definitely been improvements. For example, we have developed relations with the World Health Organization, with the World Medical Association, to try to develop norms, again, new standards on hunger strikes, on prison-related issues, on the treatment of tuberculosis in prisons, and to try to go forward and not just stay on a strictly Red Cross basis only doing visits, but trying to share with others and try to develop other norms with other organizations as well, learning from our experience. And in this case, for example, we also have very good relations with the Council of Europe Committee for the Prevention of Torture. We were with them from the very beginning, actually giving them advice at their request on how to do visits when they had no idea. They were just beginning to visit, and now they've become extremely professional. And we, of course, have close contacts with them as well.
Are there any particular stories or a story that you'd like to tell us that really sort of captures the essence of why you do what you do? A particular prisoner who affected you in some important way, a particular condition that you rectified, or so on?
Well, there's so many stories to tell. One which I often remember is a case which actually I can't even talk about. It's a situation which we no longer work in now. It's in Uruguay. And one of the leaders of the Tupamaro movement, the political movement in Uruguay, had been in prison for a very long time, and he was severely ill. He had a cancer, a rare form of cancer of the liver. And he was dying. And on one visit, I was told before I went to see him, you know, this fellow, he's on a hunger strike, said the director. And the director said, but you know, it's a phony hunger strike. Because you know as well as I do, he has cancer, he can't eat anyway, so what he's doing, it's completely fake, and his hunger strike is worthless. I took that face value, went to see the prisoner, and the prisoner was extremely angry, precisely for that reason. He says, look, you've probably been told my hunger strike is fake. And I said, yes, indeed, that's exactly what the director just told me. He says, and I'm very angry at this because I'm on a hunger strike because I want to protest against something, and it's wrong that my hunger strike is fake. They're telling everybody, they're telling the people outside, they're telling my family that my hunger strike is phony, and so I want you. You're the only person here who visits me. I want you to do something for me. I said, well, what is that? Well, today I'm going to eat. He hadn't eaten for 3 weeks. They're going to give me my meal like they do every day. I'm going to eat it in front of you, all of it, just to show you that I will end my hunger strike that way, but I want you to be able to say to my family and to my friends outside that indeed it was a real hunger strike. It's not because I can't eat. It's because I chose not to eat. And I said, my goodness, this fellow is, first of all, he's severely ill. He's been on a hunger strike for 3 weeks. He shouldn't be eating a whole big meal. Mm-hmm. But who am I to put him off it? I'm not going to be here I'm just here today to visit him. What should I do? So finally thinking it over, I said, well, let's do it. For him, it's more important at his stage of life to be able to do this. And I did it. I sat next to him. I watched him eat his meal. I said, I hope he's not going to have, nothing untoward is going to happen now. But it didn't, actually. He managed to swallow his whole meal. I went to the director and I told him exactly, no, you were wrong. It was a real hunger strike. I saw him eat. He said, really? He ate his meal? I was able to talk to his family. The fellow died a month later, not from his meal. He died from his cancer. But for him, this was very important. And he used me in a way, but I was perfectly willing to do it. And this was more important than actually making an objective medical assessment. I should have told him, no, you shouldn't eat this meal. Please keep me out of it. This is medically, it's not very wise to do it. I felt I had to do it for him. And this is one of the many, many situations you come across when you visit prisoners.
How do you overcome the frustrations, often the horrible conditions that you must be a witness to, and sometimes you can't do anything about?
Well, that's a question that comes up often mainly with our younger delegates, who see, for example, who have been working 6 months in a context in a country where the Red Cross has been working 10 years already, and they say, well, nothing happens. You know, we're visiting these people, they're being tortured, we write a report, the government does nothing with the report. Some of them feel frustrated because they can't cry out to the outside what's going on. You have to explain again that it's senseless to have yet another public report which will just block our efforts, whereas somebody else is writing about it. And I try to explain to them, yes, but you're visiting them. Is the visit useful to them or not? Ask them. Ask the prisoners whether you should be coming back or not, whether it's useful to continue knowing that perhaps indeed nothing is happening. And very often, when I've done this, in most cases I would say, the prisoners say, no, please do come back. We know nothing's happening. We know these authorities better than you do. We know that it may not work, but we need to have this contact with you. You're the only people we can see in some cases. and you can go see our family. You can tell them we're coping as best we can. So please do not suspend the visits. Even if you globally you don't stop the torture, at least it's useful for us.
What skills or trait do you have and your teams have that you think are absolutely essential for doing this work?
Listening, first of all. You have to listen. And some people want to immediately write down and document and forget to listen to what the person is saying. I always say, put down your pencil, listen first to what the person is saying, and then, and only then, take notes. If you must take notes, but you don't necessarily have to take them and forget who you're talking to. And also, arrange your work so you listen as much to the person you see at 6 p.m. as to the prisoner you saw at 8 a.m. in the morning. Because also our people often have a tendency to try to work very, very long hours because there's so many people to see. And of course, at the end of the day, when you've seen 30 people, you can't listen in the same way. And I say, that's not fair. This fellow, number 30 here, he's been waiting all day to tell you his story. And yes, it sounds very much like the story told to you already by the last 15. And so you may struggle, yes, okay, I know that already. Is there anything else? Don't do that. This person wants to talk to you about his story. It's not fair to do that. It'd be much better to come back the next day and see him first and listen. Because these people are, the only thing you can give them is your listening time and some empathy in some cases. You may not be able to change the torture. You may not be able to change the food. You will certainly not get them out of prison. The least you can do is listen to them in the same way as when you're fresh and have an early start in the morning.
And how do you show that you are listening to the prisoners in addition with empathy? Does it affect the follow-up questions that you ask? Is that the way that you keep the momentum of that process going?
Well, first of all, it depends if you're using an interpreter or not. In some cases, because I've seen so many people who don't know how to work with an interpreter. I've seen so many people who say, okay, ask him about this and such a thing, and since they don't understand what's going on, they take notes while the interpreter is talking to the prisoner. Okay. And that's disastrous. I've seen that in some cases. And of course, the prisoner shuts up completely because he says, well, anyway, this fellow, he's not interested in me. He's just asking questions. So it's yes, no, monosyllables. And so never do that. And of course, I always say, even if you don't understand the question, first of all, ask the question to the prisoner, not to the interpreter. Second of all, while the interpreter is asking the question, you look at the prisoner, even if you don't understand, watch body language, show him you have interest in the person, and be part of the discussion. The worst thing you can do is, okay, ask him the usual questions, then you just turn around and take notes on something else. I've seen that done so many times, and it's something we come back to all the time. So show the person you're interested in the person. You take his hand. As a doctor, it's very easy. You take the pulse while you're talking to someone. You show interest in the person.
So the interview process is absolutely essential to what you do.
It should be, yes, absolutely.
How would you tell students to prepare for the kind of work you do?
Students to prepare the work I do. So
prepare to do the work, the kind of work that you do. If they say, they listen to you and they say, hey, that's great, I really want to do that kind of human rights work.
Well, in my case, it would be people who do the medical aspect of the work. I would say the first thing to do is know something and know more than just something about the country you're visiting. Know something about the culture, know a few words in the language, show that you're not just this person, this white doctor coming in from Europe, parachuting into a country he doesn't even know. I saw one doctor who was in the Republic of Georgia, and he didn't even know the name of the country in Georgian. I asked him what Sakartvelo meant. He had no idea. He said, well, you're in Sakartvelo. That's the Georgian word. That's the Georgian name for the Republic of Georgia. He didn't know. In another case, actually, I was caught on that on one of my first missions in Uruguay, when one of the political prisoners wanted to prove to me that we were precisely white doctors coming in from Europe. We didn't know much about Uruguay. And I was a bit vexed because I did know something about Uruguay. He says, well, I bet you don't even know why I'm wearing this T-shirt. He said, this is another good example. And he had a T-shirt which was striped, yellow, black, yellow, black, yellow, black, yellow, black. I said, let me prove to you don't know anything about Uruguay. Well, why am I wearing this T-shirt? I said, well, okay, you got me there. I have no idea why you're wearing that T-shirt. I must confess I don't know much about football. And this was a T-shirt of a football club. But that was not the point. The point was that this was the year of the referendum in Uruguay. And the T-shirt was, as we said, black, which is negro with N, and gold, which is oro. So you had black, gold, meaning negro, oro, N-O, 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 N-O. No, 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 no. It was their way of protesting, of saying, we say no to this referendum orchestrated by the military. And of course, it was, being a football teacher, they were allowed to wear it. So this was an internal code they had. Of course, I didn't know that. But to show you, they expected us now. If you're coming all the way from Europe to visit us, you should at least know something about what's going on here, about our culture, and about our fight against this military government. So that is the extreme example, but I say at least know something about the people you're visiting.
And you're in essence, not just in your work recognizing their humanity, but also in the personal interaction, as this example just shows.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've had prisoners who were actually very aggressive, saying, your visits are totally useless, nothing has happened since the last time. And some of them really give us a hard time. And one of them actually once said to me, at the end, he said, well, don't take it personally. It's just, we will always try to provoke a bit just to see what the color of the blood is. We have to scratch a little to find out what the color of the blood is inside. And that was part, it was a test to us to see how we would take it and how we would react. And it was their way of getting out some of the tensions inside the prison. That's part of the game. That's fine. I accept that.
Do you think in the future there will be less need for people doing the kind of work you're doing, or will there be more of a need?
Well, actually, the Red Cross used to be the only organization in the field doing prison work. Actually, now we have, as I mentioned, the European teams of the CPT visiting all 40 countries of the Council of Europe. They're actually going to extend possibly to the Mediterranean basin, possibly to Central Asia. They even have a clause which would allow them to visit worldwide. There's also the additional protocol to the UN Convention Against Torture. There may, in the future, be an additional mechanism visiting worldwide. The Red Cross could very soon find itself one among many teams doing the same type of work. I just hope that by having so many teams, some governments do not use one team against the other, trying to get the best deal, so to say, and the cheapest visit possible, and that professional standards are maintained, and that the visits are done by whoever they're done in a professional way, not putting people in danger, and doing them the way we try to do them.
And do you think this philosophy of neutrality will continue in the future? That is, sort of not over-identifying with the prisoners while respecting their dignity and trying to further their interests, but at the same time not going public and in some ways deferring to the authorities in the prison?
Well, not going public is, as I said, is an ICRC policy, which the Europeans had as well. But actually, they haven't changed the policy, but in effect, it has changed because in the European countries, a tradition has developed whereby the countries now all voluntarily publish their reports. And any country that does not publish a report is seen as having something to hide. Now, this would be excellent if it developed on a worldwide scale. Of course, it's not about to happen. As to neutrality, I remember one prisoner talking to another delegate, and the delegate was explaining that the ICRC is neutral. He says, look, stop it with your neutrality. You see what's going on around here. You see what's going on in this prison, in this country. And you're visiting me. You're not neutral. You're with the victims. And in this sense, he's right. Yes, we are with the victim. We aren't neutral. In that sense, we are for the people who are suffering, who are being ill-treated, to try to improve their conditions. And the term neutrality, anyway, has changed very much since the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Neutrality doesn't have the same meaning anymore.
Dr. Reyes, I regret to say our time is up, but thank you for this fascinating journey where we have seen how the young kid who read these books about prisons went on to study medicine and do this important work in the human rights field. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.